Καλησπέρα σας. Good afternoon. Έντιμοι Υπουργέ Μεταφορών, Επικοινωνιών και Έργων, αξιότιμε Δόκτωρα Λεβέντη, εξοχότατοι πρέσβεις και εκπρόσωποι διπλωματικών αποστολών, έντιμοι κύριοι δήμαρχοι, αξιότιμοι πρόεδρε και μέλη του Συμβουλίου Επιτρόπων του Ινστιτούτου Κύπρου, διακεκριμένοι προσκεκλημένοι, αγαπητοί συνάδελφοι. Θα ήθελα να σας ευχαριστήσω όλους που μας τιμάτε σήμερα με την παρουσία σας στην τελετή έναρξης των εργασιών της έδρας Αναστάσιου Γεώργιου Λεβέντη στις αρχαιολογικές επιστήμες. Honorable Minister of Transport, Communications and Work, Honorable Dr. Leventis, Your Excellencies and representatives of diplomatic missions, Honorable Mayors, Honorable Chair and members of the Cyprus Institute's Board of Trustees, distinguished guests, dear colleagues. I would like to start by expressing our appreciation to everyone for joining us today as the Cyprus Institute marks the commencement of the activities of the Anastasias Leventis Chair in Archaeological Sciences. I would like to invite to the podium Professor Kostas Papanikolas, President of the Cyprus Institute, for a welcome address.
Honorable Minister of Transport, Communication and Works, Mrs. Vasiliki Anastasiadou, Honorable dear Dr. Leventis, Your Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. I welcome you to the Cyprus Institute this afternoon for the ceremony for the establishment of the A.G. Leventis Chair in Archaeological Sciences. This is a seminal event in the history of the development of our institute. It marks the commencement of operations of the first named chair at the Cyprus Institute. It is fitting that this comes from the prestigious A.G. Leventis Foundation, and it bears the name of its founder. We are deeply honored by the generous endowment of the foundation to support the development of research in the field of archaeological sciences, but also for the branding, as it is known that the foundation has the branding of international excellence. It is synonymous, actually, to it. Since its establishment, the mission of STAR-C, the Science and Technology in Archaeology and Culture Research Center, has been to empower archaeological and cultural research and in archaeology and heritage in Cyprus, but also in the broader area of Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East. With STAR-C's broad research range, the development of the field of archaeological sciences is of crucial significance for Cypriot archaeology and the protection of its very rich cultural heritage. We are particularly proud that the A.G. Leventis Chair in Archaeological Sciences founding appointment will be held by a scholar of the highest international reputation and caliber. Professor Thilo Röhren, the director of STAR-C, whose leadership and expertise will undoubtedly consolidate the Cyprus Institute as a local and regional leader in archaeological sciences. The Leventis Chair's scholarly activities and laboratory capacity will complement and enhance the existing infrastructure of the Science and Technology in Archaeology and Cultural Research Center, laboratories, including the recently endowed Andreas Pitas Art Characterization Laboratories, which, according to the founding policies and mission of the Cyprus Institute, all facilities are open for use and in the service of all local and regional archaeological and research communities, and in particular, young scientists and scholars. This is essential in the field of archaeological sciences, not only because of our policy, but because it is a prerequisite, such a collaboration, for success. I expect that the activities of AG Leventis Chair will further strengthen our close and expanding collaboration with the Department of Antiquities, the local and regional universities, and especially the archaeological unit of the University of Cyprus, the Leventis Municipal Museum, the AG Leventis Gallery, CARI, the Archbishop III Cultural Foundation, and many other local and regional institutions, and broad array of collaborations in Europe and the US. I'm so very pleased to see the leadership of most of those named institutions to be in the audience. It's an excellent omen for future collaboration. I will end my short welcome by thanking, first of all, the AG Leventis Foundation, its board members, and especially the chair of the board and trustee of the Cyprus Institute, Dr. Tassos Leventis. His interest and attention to every aspect and scope and planned activities of the chair has been stupendous. Many thanks are due also to the offices of the foundation, and especially to the director of the Foundation Cyprus office, Professor Haralambos Bakirtsis, for their wholehearted support over the years. We are most grateful to the Minister of Transport, Communication and Works, Mrs. Vasiliki Anastasiadou, for ennobling us with her presence and support. As the ministry in charge of the stewardship of antiquities in Cyprus, her presence is loaded with symbolism, but more importantly, with future promise. Thank you very much. Many thanks also to the director of the Department of Antiquities, Dr. Marina Solomonidou Ieronymidou, and for the successful and rapidly growing close collaboration with the Department of Antiquities, which again is an absolutely necessary condition for this laboratory to be successful and this chair to expand its scholarly activities. Professor Vassos Karagiorgis, the Nestor of Cypriot Archaeology, Director Emeritus of the Department of Antiquities and Adjunct Professor at the Cyprus Institute, for agreeing to address today's event and for his continuous encouragement, vision, and engagement in all aspects of Cypriot archaeology and cultural activities, but particularly so for helping the Star Sea develop in the right direction. I also want to thank and note the presence of Professor Marcos Martinon Torres of Cambridge University for joining us today and honoring today's celebration with a lecture that will follow at 5 p.m. Superpowered Archaeology, Archaeological Questions and Scientific Revelations, following this ceremony. Many thanks to all involved in working hard to make this today's important event a success, and especially all of you for joining this festive occasion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Paparikolas. Next, an address by Professor Thilo Reren, the first AG Leventis Professor for Archaeological Sciences.
Okay, Your Excellency, Minister Anastasiadou, dear Dr. Leventis, honorable ambassadors, trustees and guests, dear colleagues and friends. It's an absolutely great honor for me to be here today as we formally launch the AG Leventis Chair in Archaeological Sciences at the Cyprus Institute as part of Star Sea, the Science and Technology in Archaeology and Culture Research Center. I want to make this chair a beacon of academic leadership in the Eastern Mediterranean, a lighthouse which will be the first among equals. There are others in the region with whom we want to collaborate. But first, let's look at what this is, archaeological sciences, before I lay out how I intend to reach my ambitious goal. Archaeological research goes back many hundred years, and as a discipline, it's very inclusive. It draws from classics, from theology, from architecture, surveying, from philology and geography, and many more. Archaeological science, by contrast, is a much younger field. Sustained research maybe going back only about 50 years or so. But what is it then that makes it relevant, and where does it fit within the wider field of archaeology and cultural heritage? Allow me to use a metaphor here. You all know of the importance of raw materials for our modern lives, of minerals and oil and gas. Let's look at crude oil, for instance. As it comes out of the ground, it's pretty much that, crude. A barrel of oil today costs how much? About $70. That's for a ton of oil, roughly $350. For a liter of it, 30 euro cent. That sort of money. It doesn't sound much, but of course, if you have plenty of it and you sell it, you can get rich like a sheikh. Now, if we look at what we pay for the products that are made out of this cheap oil, things start to change. Even mass-produced plastic, such as PVC, cost already twice as much as the oil from which they were made. Well, not too much increase, you may say, but if you look at something other, very mundane, very common, aspirin, for instance, like any medicine, a chemical product basically made at the end from oil. A pack of 30 tablets of aspirin, how much does it cost today? 3 euros, I think. And you get 3 grams of aspirin for that. So 1 euro for 1 gram, that's 1,000 euros for a kilogram, that's 1,000,000 euros for a ton, where the raw material cost 350. So what has made possible this fantastic increase in value? Science, research, and development, know-how. The lesson? One can get rich from a mass product such as oil if one has enough of it to extract it and to sell it cheaply. But the real generation of wealth happens elsewhere, in the research, in the refining, in the processing, in the chemical pharmaceutical plants, all of which are driven by science and technology. What does it mean for us now? Archaeology, like oil, is something which you either have in your ground or you don't. Luckily, Cyprus has a lot of it. But like oil, it's a non-renewable resource, and certainly it's not one you want to sell cheaply and burn. But because of Cyprus's rich archaeology, there are many excavations here, have always been, producing archaeology. Historically, these were driven by scholars from abroad. And once excavated, the finds, the field notes, all that information went abroad to Britain, France, Italy, Germany, you name it. And with it, the fame of the research, the know-how, the expertise of the scholars remained abroad, while the island lost more and more of its heritage. If we go back to my picture of that oil-rich country, we see that such an oil-rich country may get temporarily rich from the oil, but it won't get developed. The advanced research and development companies are elsewhere, the Bayers, the Novartises of today, that make the real money through science and innovation. And they will continue to do so when the oil is long gone. And having a company such as Medochemy here, of course, in Cyprus is a great example for this development happening in this country already today. And the government of the Republic of Cyprus has recognized this long ago. And two, and wisely, invested in developing our own universities and research centers in the country, creating an innovation ecosystem, fostering knowledge, creating research within the country. In archaeology, the Archaeological Research Unit of the University of Cyprus is now a serious research institution, well respected abroad, and the Department of Antiquities runs a large number of its own excavations and employs very capable archaeologists, researchers, conservators, working with the international missions who are still here. In short, archaeology in Cyprus is now an established discipline, creating and accumulating knowledge in this country. And I think we all know whom we have to owe this. So, this is where Star C and the Cyprus Institute come into our picture, and the new chair in Archaeological Sciences. I mentioned earlier how diverse the approaches are within archaeology, and adding science and technology to this broad church adds further facets, further insights to it. Together, these different branches of science within archaeology all contribute to a host of new information about ancient production and technology and industry, about trade, about migration, transitions, about all aspects of the lives of people of long-gone generations before us. In short, with the new chair, we will use the tools of science and technology to study the technology of the past, to provenance materials, to trace their movements. But in research, not quantity counts, but quality and diversity. Of course, we will always work with our colleagues on routine research, on more mass-produced and common materials such as ceramics and metals, but as much as the pharmaceutical industry has not only aspirin to offer, thanks God, but a much wider range of products, so will we develop targeted, specific research programs for specific questions and situations. Using the science of biology, just as an example, we can much better understand the food producing, the food preparing people and their interaction with our biological environment thousands of years ago. Through computational technology, we can create not only detailed documentations at a rate and detail previously unheard of, but also enrich museum exhibits for the general public. In short, science and technology are today part of the full spectrum of archaeology. And establishing this chair in archaeological sciences here at the Institute contributes to a much wider agenda for Cyprus and the Middle East. A shift away from being just a source for raw material, away from an attitude where others come and take, a shift towards an emancipated, an empowered, an educated civil society that has the skills and resources to protect, to study, to curate their own heritage. We will develop our own agenda and accumulate knowledge and expertise as part of our own Cypriot and vibrant research ecosystem. And in a spirit of collaboration with archaeologists who excavate and document and study, with museum people who study and curate and exhibit, we are encouraged by the trust that the A.G. Leventis Foundation has placed in us. The foundation has a very proud tradition of supporting archaeology in Cyprus and Cypriot archaeology abroad, as well as supporting Cyprus's most important universities, museums, and galleries. Their support now for archaeological sciences completes that triangle of field archaeology, post-excavation research, and conservation and presentation. Importantly, such a triangle, no corner can exist by itself. It only makes sense if all the three corners work together. Now, in this sense, as the inaugural chair of the A.G. Leventis Chair, I intend to build research capacity in Cyprus, built on material science and related fields, in order to complement and support the existing archaeology and heritage institutions in the country. The transformation of copper ore from around the Troodos Mountains into copper metal is one such technology that I am personally particularly interested in. And how could one not do that on an island that is literally synonymous with copper? But also take the preparation of clay and the firing conditions that transform that clay into ceramics. There's so much to be learned about that. We will use material science methods to study the production and trade of many other materials too. Glass, plaster, pigments, they're all await to be studied, from Roman baths, from Byzantine churches, and so do bones and teeth and seeds and other plant remains. We have a whole new world ahead of us. And we will not work alone, of course, in this, but use our expertise and equipment to support others and to collaborate. We will set up a competitive visitors scheme to invite less privileged but bright scholars to the Cyprus Institute for a few weeks or a few months to do their research here and with us. Of course, the chair will work closely with the recently established Andreas Pitter's art characterization laboratories, with the Cyprus Institute's other established research activities in digital cultural heritage, in energy and environmental research, in high-performance computing. We will share what we have for the benefit of all of us in Cyprus and the wider region. In short, we will support, we will cooperate, and we will lead. If we succeed, we will be widely visible, like a lighthouse on the hill. But if we can be widely seen, then only because we are not alone. We can be seen from afar because we stand, as the saying goes, on the shoulders of giants. My research is rooted in the work of much greater scholars, and I'm supported here by a great institute and great colleagues who have welcomed me to this beautiful island. And I certainly don't see me as the top of that metaphorical hill. I see me as a link between what came before and what will come after, as but one stepping stone in a long journey. Therefore, we will expand and improve our doctoral program to form the next generation of scholars. They will be able to see even further than we do today, future scholars from Cyprus and from the region, who hopefully will then find work in Cyprus and in the region, further contributing to the growth of this research ecosystem that I've mentioned before. Thus, holding the A.G. Leventis Chair is not only an opportunity, it is a privilege, as much as a responsibility towards those who come after us. I thank all of you who have given me their trust, the members of the board and the leaders of the Cyprus Institute, and in particular the trustees and the chairman of the A.G. Leventis Foundation, for their outstanding support in establishing this chair. In short, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Tiloreren. I would like to invite now to the podium Professor Vassos Karagiorgis, who doesn't really need any introductions.
Επίσημοι, ladies and gentlemen, the title of my talk is Research in Cypriot Archaeology Today, Changes and Perspectives. In summer 1951, I returned from my studies in UK, holding a BA degree in classics with specialization in classical archaeology. In September of the same year, I was sent to excavate at Salamis in my capacity as assistant curator of the Cyprus Museum. At the university, I followed courses about Greek sculpture and vase painting of the classical period, but my acquaintance with Cypriot pottery and sculpture was minimal, based on some visits I paid to the Cypriot collections in the British Museum. Cypriot archaeology was at that time considered a local affair. which was not taught at any university. The situation today is completely different, and Cypriot archaeology is considered as one of the main players of the cultural arena of Mediterranean archaeology. Archaeologists working in the Near East, Anatolia, Egypt, the Aegean, and the Western Mediterranean cannot possibly ignore it, as very often in their excavations and research they encounter Cypriot artifacts and other Cypriot cultural influences. In the same way, Cypriot archaeologists have to have their eyes open and be able to identify correctly artifacts from all the lands which I mentioned above. Methods in archaeology have changed drastically, and the targets of archaeological research as well. I encountered the problems of provenance of artifacts quite early in my archaeological career, when I decided to write my doctoral thesis on the Mycenaean vases of the pictorial style found in Cyprus and the Levant. Following the great experts of the time, I submitted my thesis in 1957. Many of you were not born at that time. I was a staunch supporter of the theory proposed by the gurus of Mycenaean ceramics, Arne Furmark and Frank Stubbings of Cambridge, based on the false criteria of appearance. I had to oppose the ideas of Åke Åkerström and Hector Catling that all the Mycenaean pottery found in the Mediterranean was made in the Argolid. You see Mycenaean pottery here. Often with the Eastern market in mind, hence the occurrence of shapes and decorative motifs of certain classes of Mycenaean vases recalling Cypriot pottery. I show you here, if this works. It doesn't. The crater at the top with the fishes and the crater at the bottom are of Mycenaean type. This one was made in the Argolid. This one was made in Cyprus. Neutron activation of these ceramics provided the correct answer, which was contrary to what I and many others propagated. Thus, the application of science to archaeology through neutron activation analysis of clay put an end to several years of controversy in which I and several others played a leading role. I had the wisdom to be converted to the new religion of scientific technology for solving archaeological problems without persistence to my original beliefs. After this experience, I knew how to go about when I faced another problem of provenance, namely that of terracotta statues and figurines of Cypriot type found in the Aegean. With a team of experts from the research center Democritus of Athens, we analyzed the clay of such objects found in the archaic sanctuaries of Samos, Rhodes, and elsewhere, and established a correct typology and provenance, which was published in a book published by the A.G. Leventis Foundation. These are drinking cups of Cypriot shape, but of Mycenaean provenance from the Argolid. This is the book I mentioned to you. This book was published in 2009. Earlier, together with a group of scientists, again from Democritus, we embarked on yet another project of provenance studies of limestone statuettes of Cypriot type found in the Aegean and Naucratis in Egypt through the analysis of stone. The results were again published in a book published by the A.G. Leventis Foundation in 2002. We thus solved two major problems of Greek archaeology of the Archaic period, in which Cyprus played a major role, distinguishing what was an import from Cyprus or a local imitation from the Aegean and Egypt. We are gratified that the A.G. Leventis Foundation had already foreseen the trends in archaeological research with the encouragement of Provenance studies in 2002 and 2009, thus paving the ground for a further development at the Cyprus Institute, which we are celebrating today. There are still numerous archaeological problems ahead of us, waiting for a solution through the application of scientific technologies. The problem of the origin of the Cypriot fabrics, like the bichrome wheel-made and the red lustrous wheel-made ware, has not yet been solved. The cost for extensive projects of analysis is prohibitive for individual scholars and even for some institutions. Perhaps this is the time now for the Cyprus Institute to undertake it, again with the support of the A.G. Leventis Foundation, but with a reservation. The problem is archaeological and should not be solved and should be solved together with archaeologists. Technologies will give answers according to the precision of the questions which archaeologists will ask. A major problem which archaeologists often face is the correct identification of materials. We read about glass, paste, frit, faience, glazed pottery, without any scientific scrutiny of such identification. In 1973, we published an ivory throne and an ivory bed from Salamis tomb 79, dating to about 700 BC. Both had plaques inlaid with pieces of what I call blue glass, following the identification proposed by Max Mallawan in 1966 for the Nimrud ivories of the same period. Is this the blue glass of the inlays what Homer meant by the word kianos? This is a problem for you, Professor Thilo Reren. Very kindly, you have already accepted my challenge to solve it, and I am very grateful to you. Archaeologists bringing to light materials during excavations are conscious of numerous problems of conservation, which are well known, and I will not mention them here. We had an exciting experience in 1967 when a silver bowl something happened. You see that I'm not very good in technologies, and it is too late to learn. A silver bowl was found in Salamis tomb. No, the previous one. In Salamis tomb 2, with a heavily corroded surface. This one. You can see that it is decorated, but you cannot recognize any of the decorated motifs. Its thin walls could hardly sustain a rigorous mechanical or other treatment. We sent the bowl to the laboratory of the Institute of Archaeology of the University of London. They cleaned it and discovered that the inside of this Phoenician bowl of the Cypro-Phoenician bowl of the 7th century BC was decorated with a palimpsest, that is, one decoration upon an earlier, upon an earlier one which had fainted. The decoration of the two periods were successfully retrieved on paper. By what I have said up to now, I did not intend to convey to you that the impression that archaeology should or could become an exact science. Far from it. Those of us dealing with the archaeology of the Mediterranean, the Near East and Egypt will continue to use Homer, Herodotus, and other Greek and Latin authors, the Bible, and the numerous Oriental texts to enrich our knowledge of the past. The life of man has many other aspects of non-material nature. What I meant by underlining the numerous ways of science and technology can help us in our effort to learn more about life in the past and the achievements of mankind is that now we have a precious ally which can make our task easier and which will help us to be more precise in our state archaeological reports. We are not and use less often the words probably and possibly. We are not called to apply the scientific methods ourselves, but to learn how and when to use them, not to surrender unconditionally to all their pronouncements without a discussion, but to start a dialogue with them, to give them all the facts so that their judgment may be nearer to truth and reality. By discussing a carbon-14 or dendrochronology dating method with the scientists, we do not always have to accept their verdict, but we both have to listen to what both parties have to say and search a consensus and understanding. I am fully aware of the fact that the purchase of all the equipment of the laboratory which is necessary for the application of all the scientific technologies which I mentioned above is a costly undertaking. The Cyprus Institute has made some impressive progress earlier this year with the purchase of such equipment thanks to the generosity of Dr. Andreas Pittas. We look forward to similar progress now with the generosity of the A.G. Leventis Foundation. What is finally needed, and this does not cost any money, but goodwill and sheer common sense, is for all the relevant research institutions in Cyprus which deal with archaeology to join forces to organize a well-funded research center which will enable all archaeologists, Cypriots and foreign, to work together on equal footing for the application of science and technology to archaeological research. Our generation owes this to Cyprus, to the younger generation of scholars, and to the archaeology of the Mediterranean area. We owe it to the generosity of the foundations which has been demonstrated in such a practical way, and their confidence in our research institutions. I conclude by expressing gratitude to the A.G. Leventis Foundation through you, Dr. Tassos Leventis, for this new generous gesture in favor of archaeology, and sincere thanks to you, Professor Thilo Reren, for many exciting successes in Stark Sea of the Cyprus Institute. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Karagiorgis. I would like to invite Dr. Tassos Leventis, Chairman of the A.G. Leventis Foundation, who kindly made the effort to come from London for this event.
So, Honourable Minister, Excellencies, Honourable Mayors, Chair and members of the Cyprus Institute's Board of Trustees, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. There won't be any pretty pictures here, I'm afraid. It's a great pleasure to attend the official launch of the aged Leventis Chair of Archaeological Sciences at the Science and Technology in Archaeology and Cultural Research Center of the Cyprus Institute. The Aged Leventis Foundation has enjoyed a long association with the Institute and has supported in particular the work of STARC, a center which adapts and applies the latest technology to archaeological research. The Institute, with its wider links to leading universities and specialized institutes, has, of necessity, concentrated its technological research and development in well-defined areas. STARC is a prime example of such specialization, supporting as it does the archaeology of Cyprus and the wider region by studying material production and provenance. And we've heard quite a lot about that this evening. Cyprus is, of course, possibly the cultural crossroads of the region, with all of its implicit manufacturing, packaging, shipping, and trading activity over millennia. Cyprus, too, was a major producer, of course, of copper and its derivatives. This background has created a unique archaeology and heritage which can be accurately assessed only through a collaboration between archaeological fieldwork, history of art and cultures, and laboratory-based research. Our newly appointed Professor of Archaeological Sciences, Thilo Reren, described the historic position of Cyprus using a graphic model, at least graphic for me, because I think he knows one of my particular interests. Cyprus plays an important role for migratory birds. Protecting biodiversity and environment there is, for this reason, important for bird populations on a much wider scale. Similarly, by covering and analyzing the archaeology of Cyprus, we contribute and protect the archaeological heritage of a much wider, well-connected region. Thilo's ambitions in this context, we've heard a lot of some detail on this, but of course I'll repeat something, include, for example, studying further the movements of amphoria or copper through scientific analysis, which advances an understanding of economic and political links between societies. This process can be extended even to regions outside the Eastern Mediterranean, but clearly within the scope of material science. The study, for example, of historic glass manufacture in ancient West Africa, and the probability that this is in fact an indigenous invention and not a technology imported from the Mediterranean basin. I'm sure that you will all know a little bit about the connections that our family has with West Africa, and that we are happy to encourage and support a link between it and the Institute, even if that eventually serves to disprove a trade or manufacturing link between the two. It is for these reasons then, and many others of course, that the trustees of the Aged Leventis Foundation have supported the establishment of a chair in archaeological sciences at STARC. Professor Reren is a world leader in his field. Under his guidance, his well-established team of associates will broaden horizons for research and further integrated it with postgraduate teaching. Collaboration across disciplines and between institutions are fundamental to an efficient application of knowledge and to the sensible utilization of restricted resources. I will therefore conclude by encouraging Professor Reren and his colleagues, and we've heard quite a lot about this earlier as well, to develop and strengthen such linkages as far as it is possible to do so within Cyprus, as well as in the wider international academic and research community. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Leventis. We will now have an address by the Honorable Minister of Transport, Communications and Works, Mrs. Vasiliki Anastasiadou.
After all these speeches, I'm 100% confident about the future of this chair. Thank you very much, the speakers. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, I'm delighted to be with you here today for the ceremony celebrating the establishment of the A.G. Leventis Chair in Archaeological Sciences at the Cyprus Institute. It is with great pleasure that I accepted the invitation of the Institute's President, Professor Kostas Papanikolas, to address this important event. In my capacity as Minister of Transport, Communication and Works, I oversee the work of the Department of Antiquities of the Republic of Cyprus, which is responsible for the management and protection of our rich cultural heritage. In order to carry out its mission in the most effective manner possible, the department cooperates closely with a multitude of stakeholders. Within this framework, I became acquainted with the exciting work of STARC, the Cyprus Institute Science and Technology in Archaeology and Cultural Research Center, especially in the fields of archaeology and cultural heritage research. The close and fruitful cooperation between STARC and the Department of Antiquities is framed through a memorandum of understanding and extends to an array of activities. I should mention, in particular, the preparation of important European research proposals, such as the SIMTAS teaming proposal for the establishment of a Center of Excellence for Simulation and Data Science in Cyprus. The recently signed Memorandum of Understanding for the establishment of the Cyprus Dendrochronology Laboratory at STARC, which also involves collaboration with Cornell University, is another significant step in our joint efforts. Overall, STARC and the Cyprus Institute contribute greatly to the study, analysis, preservation, and protection of the rich cultural heritage of our island. STARC's foundation and impressive growth has been and continues to be aligned with the needs of specialists of the field. It supports and enhances the work of responsible authorities such as the Department of Antiquities, our museums, cultural foundations, institutions, and foreign archaeological expeditions. More specifically, STARC has been a pioneer in Cyprus in the fields of archaeological sciences, digital cultural heritage, scientific visualization, bioarchaeology, and art characterization. Its work has significantly strengthened research in the island, offering opportunities to young researchers and students. It thus contributes directly to our efforts to transform Cyprus into an economy driven by knowledge and innovation. Special mention should be made to the development of Dioptra, the Edme Leventis digital library of Cypriot culture, an important platform for the management of data that allows the dissemination of the treasures of Cypriot heritage across the globe. Following and building on these successes, the founding of the A.G. Leventis Chair in Archaeological Sciences is of exceptional importance. The Anastasias G. Leventis Foundation has always been a steadfast supporter and contributor to the growth, vision, and development of STARC. The critical role of the Leventis Foundation in the preservation, protection, and study of Cypriot cultural heritage is indisputable. the unwavering commitment and generous support of the Foundation towards all aspects of cultural life and education in the island, including the Department of Antiquities, has been of fundamental significance. Allow me to sincerely express the deep appreciation of the Cyprus government to the Foundation and its chairman and trustee of the Cyprus Institute, Dr. Tassos Leventis, for this particularly important donation. The establishment of the Leventis Chair in Archaeological Sciences is of great significance for further enriching STARCY's activities, as it will enable the expansion of research into fundamental areas of archaeological scientific research, such as metallurgy, ceramic production, and glass. I want to congratulate the Cyprus Institute for attracting Professor Tilo Reren, who will assume the Leventis Chair in Archaeological Sciences as the director of STARCY. Professor Reren is a scientist of international caliber with a substantial track record of research in the region and a well-developed regional network. I'm certain he will be welcomed warmly by our local archaeological and academic community. His research has underlined the importance of the material and the natural sciences in shedding light on the achievements of past societies, especially in understanding the technological processes related to the manufacture of metals, glass, glazes, ceramics, and aspirins. I am confident that under his leadership, STARCY will continue growing into a center of excellence, serving both as a national and regional resource, attracting advanced research activity and competitive funds to Cyprus. I will conclude by expressing my warmest wishes and congratulations for the installation of Professor Reren at A.G. Leventis Chair in Archaeological Sciences at the Cyprus Institute. I also wish to express my great appreciation to the Leventis Foundation and its chairman, Mr. Leventis, for this very important gesture of support and engagement. On behalf of the Ministry of Transport, Communication and Works, I want to assure you of the continuing support of the government and myself in the Institute's future growth. Looking forward to an even closer collaboration between STARCY and the Department of Antiquities, I wish you every success in your fascinating and praiseworthy work. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Anastasiadou. I would like now to invite the chairman of the A.G. Leventis Foundation, Dr. Tassos Leventis, and Professor Dan Olofriska, chair of the Cyprus Institute's Board of Trustees, to award Professor Tilo Reren with a commemorating certificate. Thank you all. Thank you. This part of today's event has come to a conclusion. We would like to express our gratitude once again to the Leventis Foundation for their generous donation, to the Minister of Transport, Communications and Work for his support and presence here, and to all our distinguished guests for being with us today. We will now have a short break for refreshments, and very soon we will have the pleasure of hosting Professor Marcos Martinon Torres for a public lecture on superpowered archaeology, archaeological questions, and scientific relations. For now, please join us for refreshments. Thank you. Thank you for being here. I would just like to let you know that on the 27th of September, at 6 o'clock, we will have another very interesting lecture Enrico Fermi lecture by Professor Smamelotti on molecular science and cultural heritage, and we'll be very happy to see you again on that occasion here. But without waiting more, let me welcome you back. Having concluded the ceremony for the commencement of the activities of the A.G. Leventis Chair in Archaeological Sciences, we now have the pleasure of welcoming to the Cyprus Institute Professor Markos Martinon Torres. I would like to invite Professor Dan Olofriska, Chair of the Cyprus Institute's Board of Trustees, for a welcome address.
Ladies and gentlemen, this will be very short. I would like only on behalf of the Board of Trustees to express the appreciation for the fact that we are here together to celebrate something that has become systemic in Western Europe. We are living in an era where public spending on research has not been growing. And what this means is that we are thrown back on the generosity and benevolence of private foundation. And in this sense, we are very, very happy that the Leventis Foundation stepped up and helped us, because this is a young institution which still has some degree of fragility, and this now reduces that to a very considerable amount. Now, after this, I think the lady who will introduce the speaker will take the podium.
Thank you. Let us have Dr. Eronimidou, who is the Director of the Department of Antiquities, to introduce our guests.
Thank you. Well, hello. I have to change my address. There is no honorable minister. I don't know if there are any excellencies, but there are definitely distinguished guests. Professor Karagiorgis, Mr. Bagirtzis, Professor Papanikolas, Mr. Leventis, Mr. Britas, Board of Trustees, friends, colleagues. It is with great pleasure that I address this welcome note this afternoon in the occasion of the public lecture that will be delivered by Professor Markos Martinon Torres as part of the ceremony for the commencement of activities of the A.G. Leventis Chair in Archaeological Sciences at the Cyprus Institute. The Department of Antiquities shares a strong connection with the Cyprus Institute, and specifically with SARC, the Science and Technology in Archaeology and Cultural Research Center, as we have long collaborated in a wide range of activities aiming at further developing archaeological research on the island. The Department of Antiquities, as the governmental department responsible for the control, management, protection, research, and promotion of the archaeological heritage of Cyprus, aims at establishing collaborations with leading institutions in the field of research and innovation, and apply state-of-the-art technologies, not only to address research questions, but also as a means to address needs that relate to the management of the island's rich archaeological heritage. The application of such advances, and certainly such collaborations, largely contributes in the important mission of the Department of Antiquities, as the outcomes positively affect the sustainable development of the society and also of the economy. In particular, at the Department of Antiquities, we currently control, manage, and preserve about something like 1,500 listed ancient monuments on the island as per the Antiquities law, as well as museums in all the cities and their broader districts. One of our primary objectives is also to protect all movable and immovable artifacts from illegal activities such as looting and trafficking, and promote research for providing new information that will elucidate further the role of our archaeological heritage in socio-economic development. It is needless to underline how important the scientific research focusing on the examination of the traits of ancient artifacts is, as also is the documentation and digital recording of all the associated attributes for safeguarding the archaeological heritage. One can grasp the importance of the activities we share together with StarC if the modern-day conditions in which we all live in are considered. Conditions which unfortunately include economic crisis, the destruction of the environment, and other man-made or natural disasters, and of course, armed conflicts. It is therefore of utmost importance to focus our efforts on conducting risk assessments for archaeological sites, monuments, and museums, documenting and restoring all features, and even reproducing them by the use of technology. Modern-day threats also imply the digitization of archival material so as to protect and preserve this long-collected knowledge for future reference, use, and research. Moreover, the development in building activities and constructions, which has recently increased, I wouldn't dare say unfortunately, but for us it is, following the economic crisis, necessitates the application of methods such as geophysics that enable the understanding of the character of sites and landscapes and define the research that needs to be undertaken and, of course, decision-making and management. These activities as a whole are key to the strategies of the Department of Antiquities, and I personally am pleased that we are in the position to put them forward and work towards their implication in collaboration with the Cyprus Institute. A significant part of our collaboration, aiming at accomplishing the aforementioned objectives, includes European research proposals, such as the SIMDAS project proposal, which is a Horizon 2020 teaming project for the creation of a center of excellence for simulation and data analysis. We do hope that the project will be successfully evaluated also for phase 2, and that such an important center will be created, as it is vital to monitor, digitize, analyze, and ultimately store for further exploitation data deriving from a wide range of fields. It is important that archaeological data can also be explored this way, as new paths of research will emerge, contributing towards the preservation, study, and exploration of all archaeological and cultural attributes and values. Another significant aspect of our collaboration is the recent signed Memorandum of Understanding for the establishment of the Cyprus Dendrochronology Laboratory at StarC, which the Department of Antiquities has signed together with the Department of Forests, Cornell University, and the Cyprus Institute. Undoubtedly, StarC has contributed significantly in the fields of archaeological sciences, digital cultural heritage, scientific visualization, bioarchaeology, and art characterization, also recently endowed with a donation by Dr. Andreas Bitas. Furthermore, the development of Dioptra, the Leventis Digital Library for Cypriot Culture, has provided an important platform for the management of data and the development of education and the dissemination of knowledge concerning the Cypriot culture on an international level. Thus, the overall results of such projects support our work in the sphere of archaeological research and management, conservation and protection of archaeological heritage. Most importantly, the placement of Professor Tilo Reren in the position of the director of StarC is a very significant addition towards further expanding the potential of the Cyprus Institute in the development of research and innovation in archaeology. Professor Reren, you've already heard, but I have to insist on this, is a renowned archaeologist internationally with very important work in archaeological science in Europe and beyond. His internationally celebrated research in understanding the technological processes related to the manufacture of metals, glass, glazes, and ceramics has highlighted the significant role of the material and natural sciences in understanding past societies. We are certain that his presence in Cyprus will contribute immensely in developing further research, not only in Cyprus, but also the Eastern Mediterranean in general, and that STAR-C, under his guidance, will continue to grow. Professor Reren, myself, and my colleagues from the Department of Antiquities would like to welcome you officially on the island and let you know that we look forward to working together for the benefit of Cypriot archaeology. In fact, Professor Reren's contribution in archaeology and academia makes the founding of the A.G. Leventis Chair in Archaeological Sciences in STAR-C even more important, as more specialized laboratory infrastructure will develop, which will promote interdisciplinary research and also develop job opportunities for younger scientists. The founding of this A.G. Leventis Chair also manifests the constant and diachronic support and commitment of the Anastasias G. Leventis Foundation in the development and protection of the archaeological heritage of the island. I have repeatedly underlined the significant support of the Leventis Foundation in the work of the Department of Antiquities concerning the preservation of our heritage. Allow me to once more express my gratitude to the Foundation and its chairman and trustee of the Cyprus Institute, Mr. Tassos Leventis, for his generous and constant support. Having stressed the importance of archaeological material science and the need to make it stronger here in Cyprus as well, it is now time to call for Professor Marcos Martinon Torres for his lecture. Professor Martinon Torres is a specialist in the application of scientific methods to archaeological artifacts as a means to examine their origins, manufacture, and chronology. Despite his young age, Professor Martinon Torres is a scholar with a very rich background, as he has been Professor of Archaeological Science at the Institute of Archaeology at University College London, a position which enabled him to lead a team of international researchers and produce important research in the field of materials science. Professor Martinon Torres has authored over 120 academic publications, delivered public lectures in different countries, and received numerous research grants and awards. At present, he serves as co-editor of the Journal of Archaeological Science and president-elect of the Society for Archaeological Sciences. We're very happy to learn that he has very recently taken up the Pitt Rivers Chair of Archaeological Science at the University of Cambridge, while we all know of his prominent work on China's terracotta army, medieval alchemy, and archaeometallurgy. We are very pleased to have him with us here today to celebrate the A.G. Leventis Chair in Archaeological Sciences. The lecture is entitled Superpowered Archaeology, Archaeological Questions and Scientific Revelations, and we all look forward to learning more on how scientific analysis enables us to understand past societies through the objects they produced and left behind. Professor.
Dr. Solomonidou, for your introduction, and thank you, my distinguished hosts and their guests, and generally friends and colleagues, for having me here. I am truly honored and delighted in joining you for this, which is primarily a celebration, as far as I see it. I am, as an archaeologist, but more generally as a member of the public, I am, of course, aware with just some of the many philanthropic initiatives supported by the A.G. Leventis Foundation. At UCL, where I used to work, for example, we did have an A.G. Leventis gallery of Cypriot and Eastern Mediterranean archaeology. And indeed in Cambridge, where I work now at the University of Cambridge, again, among many other that I could list, there is a A.G. Chair A.G. Leventis Chair in the Faculty of Classics, as well as very recently a fellowship in African archaeology that we're all very, very excited about. And there are, of course, other personal and institutional ties that link the University of Cambridge and the Cyprus Institute. One of them that I'm sure you're all aware is, of course, the field project and excavation at Keros. But also, more recently, there is the European Union-funded PROMIST project, recently awarded to Star C, that will, or is already enabling partnerships and knowledge exchange between the Cyprus Institute, Cambridge, and other centers of excellence in archaeological science. So there are many reasons why I'm very happy to be joining and why I feel a part of this celebration. And of course, this new chair is yet another extremely important step in supercharging archaeological science, not only in Cyprus, but beyond, because I'm sure there will be a rippling effect reaching across the Mediterranean and beyond. It's already being heard, I believe. And I've been asked specifically not to dwell too much on my praise for the incumbent, Professor Thilo Rehren, and to talk about archaeological sciences in general instead. And so I am going to honor his wishes, but not before I tell you something that you know already, that is that you could not possibly think of a better appointment for this role, because there is certainly nobody as knowledgeable and generous of his knowledge and inspiring and enabling and creative as him. He is a unique force of nature, and I think we all know that. But as I promised, I will focus instead on archaeological sciences generally. There have been some examples mentioned before, but I would like to elaborate why it is worth supporting the archaeological sciences. And as a way of introduction, I thought I would perhaps start by inviting you to play a game. One that I suspect you may have played before in the comfort of your sofa at home, but we're going to try and play here just briefly, a pretend game. We're going to play Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? And so let's imagine that you've already answered 14 questions correctly. You've reached the last stage. We are just one step from getting our $1 million. And so the question is proposed. And that question is, where is the future of archaeology? Now, as per the usual rules of this game, you're going to be given 4 options. And one is A, field excavation. The future of archaeology is at archaeological sites, where we excavate and make archaeological discoveries. Option B is the future of archaeological science involves a new Indiana Jones film, which will guarantee a future for our discipline. Option C would be the laboratory. And option D, perhaps more bleak, is the future of archaeology is unemployment. Now, this is a difficult question. There is a lot at stake, and so you might opt to go for the I'll ask the audience option. I've already gathered opinions, I've already done my survey, and so the results look like this. And now you have to make your choice. If you're the contestant, you might well go with the public, or you might indeed, and it happens in some cases, go with your instinct and with your wisdom and your own advice and your knowledge. And this is, of course, what Dr. Leventis and the A.G. Leventis Foundation generally did. They went with their advice and wisdom, and they knew that this was a trick question. And they realized that the correct answer is a combination of two. The future of archaeology is in the field and in the laboratory. We need both together to ensure a suitable future for our discipline. Now, we're all familiar with the image of the archaeologist making important discoveries in the field. And there are many examples of that here in Cyprus, of course. Here we have an example of the excavations of thousands of figurines in Naya Irene, and perhaps more relevant here, we have here excavations led by Professor Karagiorgis in a very renowned site that you all recognize. And so these field discoveries are the bread and butter of archaeology, and the one on the left in particular, of course, allows me to acknowledge the seminal work of Professor Karagiorgis, not only in exposing and studying archaeological remains, but also through the Cyprus Institute and the Leventis Foundation and other channels, really placing Cypriot archaeology on the world map. But the reason why I bring them here is that, of course, this needs to continue. We need to continue to make discoveries in archaeological sites. We need to continue excavating. But also, I think, increasingly, we would recognize that more and more archaeological discoveries are made in scientific laboratories, or at least taking advantage of scientific techniques. And this is the part of archaeology that I would like to elaborate on today a little bit. There have been some examples mentioned before. I will just take you through a few headlines and snapshots of other case studies that illustrate some of the potential applications of the archaeological sciences. This will necessarily and inevitably be a rather biased personal take on things. I cannot cover everything, and so obviously I just present those case studies, or some of them, of projects that I'm actively involved with or that I have been involved with. And I should also disclaim at this point that equally all of these are collective projects. I will not have the time to name all the individuals involved, but of course I can only take partial credit for the results that I'm presenting here. And the first case study I would like to just present briefly has to do broadly with prehistoric trade in the Mediterranean. And that's therefore something that many of you will already be familiar with in a broader sense, because, as has been mentioned previously, it is practically impossible to talk about prehistoric trade in the Mediterranean without referring to Cyprus. And so there you have a sketch map of the Eastern Mediterranean in the late Bronze Age, where you can really see Cyprus acting as a hub that is importing a lot of commodities, also exporting others such as pottery, and most famously, copper, the metal that's named after Cyprus, that was traded most conspicuously in the form of these oxide ingots and turns out in places such as the Black Sea, Egypt, and other places into the Western Mediterranean. Of course, we can tell about this trade because scientific techniques allow us to trace these materials to their geological sources. However, I won't be talking so much about metals, at least not for now, in terms of Mediterranean trade, but I would like to focus instead on this material that's hinted at here with this red arrow coming from the north. I will be talking briefly about amber. As many of you will know, amber is a fossil resin of some trees. So you get the resin from the tree, and over a process that takes tens of millions, sometimes hundreds of millions of years, it polymerizes, and it becomes this kind of translucent stone that can then be carved into beautiful things. Very recently, we've just published this study with some Spanish colleagues. We've undertaken a rather intensive survey and study of both geological and archaeological amber in the Iberian Peninsula. There is a lot of geological amber in the Iberian Peninsula. If you just look at the blue and yellow shaded areas in that map, that's where we have geological amber. Here are some samples. And then there is a lot of archaeological evidence for the use of amber in the form of beads in necklaces, etc., represented here with those stars of various colors. So we wanted to understand which sources of amber were used for which types of objects in which periods. And for that purpose, we used primarily FTIR, Fourier Transform Infrared Spectroscopy, which is a technique for molecular analysis that allows us to fingerprint the amber or many other organic products based on their botanical origin, as well as date and the molecular bonds that form during fossilization, depending on the age. Anyway, just to give you a few headlines, one of the main findings of our study is that virtually there is no use of locust amber in European prehistory, in spite of the widespread presence of amber objects. So where does the amber come from? If we look first at the late Bronze Age, that period when the copper oxide ingots of Cyprus are circulating around the Mediterranean and beyond, what we have here is a reference spectrum and then some examples of archaeological spectra from FTIR. And what we see is in this diagnostic region, the so-called Baltic shoulder. This is all amber that came from the Baltic. Now, this was long suspected, and we know through other strands of archaeological evidence that most likely this Baltic amber went down through Central Europe and then was traded from the Mediterranean. Because when we find it in Spain, it is usually associated to silver and iron and Mediterranean ceramics, etc. This is something that we long suspected, that we now have much more material evidence for it. But perhaps more surprising was the fact that when you look at earlier amber, late Neolithic and Chalcolithic, what we find is that it's almost invariably from Sicily. Again, not from the Iberian Peninsula. This is interesting for several reasons. One of them, the fact that we have no other evidence of, as far as I'm aware, of any significant connection between Sicily and the Iberian Peninsula for this period. So it is something that archaeological science is revealing. And secondly, this is interesting because the distribution of Sicilian amber in the Iberian Peninsula maps quite well with the distribution of African ivory, and therefore suggests that there may have been an African connection in this trade, and more generally reminds us of the need to include Northern Africa in our studies of the Mediterranean. And since I mentioned Africa and moving on from amber, let me invite you to go farther south into Africa, into the depths of sub-Saharan Western Africa, to introduce one man that you may or may not have heard of, Mr. Mansa Musa of Mali. Mansa Musa was the Sultan or king of Mali in the earlier part of the 14th century, and perhaps some people here will not have heard of him, in spite of the fact that if you Google, and I invite you to do it, if you Google the richest person in history, you will get Mansa Musa. You will not get Bill Gates. When you correct for inflation, his wealth is estimated to have been around $300 billion. And this wealth was primarily derived from the fact that he controlled some of the most important gold fields in Western Africa. As a devout Muslim, he embarked on a pilgrimage to Mecca, which is recorded historically, and we know that about, well, according to historical sources, but there are several of them, around 60,000 people traveled with him, and each of them was carrying about 2 kilos of gold. There were also 60, if I remember correctly, 60 camels, each of which carrying between 100 and 200 kilos of gold. So do your maths, and that was just a single trip. So they were traveling across the thousands of kilometers of desert in the Sahara, redistributing that gold to those in need, and allegedly commissioning the creation of a mosque every week. Now, why am I talking about him here? Well, for 2 reasons. One, because I think he's a fascinating character that should be better known in our often Eurocentric histories of the world. But secondly, and perhaps of more relevance here, is that through events like this, and in this period, we know very well that there was quite intense movement of gold and other commodities across the Sahara Desert during the Islamic period. But this raises an interesting question that has been raised several times, and particularly last year. Sorry, I don't know what I've just done. Is it possible that there was trade of gold across the Sahara before the Islamic period? Now, the question has been raised again recently by an Africanist, David Philipson, and it is one that we are now trying to chase. And we are doing that through the study of coins. So we're going to focus for a second on that northern part of Africa and the Mediterranean more generally. During the pre-Islamic period, most of these mints and others, the typical gold coin that they would be minting, is the well-known solidus, plural solidi, the typical gold currency of the time. But recently, David Philipson has highlighted the fact that during a particular period, the mint of Carthage started to mint solidi that look slightly different, which he differentiates as globular as opposed to the standard solidi. Now, this shape of the coins changes at a time where historically we know the Carthage mint broke away from Constantinople for political reasons that I don't have to go into, which suggests Carthage may have had to find its own source of gold. Now, these differences between the types of coins become more apparent when you look at them under the microscope, and you can actually see for the standard solidi, they have been cut out of a sheet of metal, and so they are very flat and with sharp edges, whereas you can see the globular solidi have been, each of them stamped or struck individually in a globule of gold. So they have this squashed shape. So it's a different technology, clearly, and the question is it a different source, and might this different source be sub-Saharan Africa? We're only really in early stages of these project. We are trying to get funding now to take it farther, so I will not be able to tell you anything very conclusive, but I'll tell you where we are, which is hopefully interesting enough. In this graph here, we have chemical data for the composition of standard solidi minted in Constantinople. We are plotting silver and copper, not the gold. The balance is gold. So they are very pure coins with relatively low amounts of silver and copper as impurities. So we can take these as the group that represents the typical refined gold that would be circulating around the Mediterranean at the time and used in most mints, regardless of the specific sources. Now, if we plot there the composition of the standard flat solidi minted in Carthage, we find a distribution that's very similar and therefore consistent with the same source or sources of gold, which would be the typical refined gold of the Mediterranean. Now, what happens when we plot the composition of those peculiar globular solidi? Well, that mostly they fall out. It is still a very pure gold with relatively low silver and copper, but it seems to systematically fall outside the typical cluster. So the question we still need to address is, could this be lateritic gold from West Africa? It is, in theory, consistent in terms of its composition, but what we're missing now is anchors, that is reference material made of gold in Western Africa that we can compare here, as well as trace element analysis that will allow us to characterize this gold better. But this is quite tantalizing, as tantalizing things get when we look at the relevant archaeology. In very recent years, Sam Nixon and Professor Till Rehren have been publishing ceramic molds such as these, found mostly in Tademeka and other sites in Western Africa. Now, analysis of these molds shows that they contain traces of gold. Now, these molds are much later than the period that I'm investigating. These are date to the Islamic period. And they have traces of gold, and they would have been ideal to melt the gold dust there and create individual globules of gold that could then be sent across the Sahara to be minted individually to produce globular solidi. I insist this is a much later archaeological find, but might there be similar molds in West Africa that we just haven't found yet? We haven't, as I said, concluded this study. We are hoping to take it forward in the near future. But if we confirm what we're beginning to see here, it, I think, would revolutionize quite significantly what we thought we knew about trans-Saharan trade, and particularly its origins before the Islamic domination. And so these are just two examples of how we can use archaeological sciences to source materials and reconstruct trade patterns and so on. But I would also like to highlight how, through the study of archaeological sciences, we can also understand people through their technological activities. That is, through what they did with these raw materials, how they transformed them into objects, how they exchanged them, used them, valued them, and so on. And in order to illustrate that with a different case study, I thought I would introduce you to yet another man who is depicted here. This man is known as El Dorado, the Golden One. And he's particularly famous since he appeared depicted on the famous Muisca raft of El Dorado. This object, which is about the size of the palm of my hand, is the most important, arguably, heritage object in South America, or at least it's held as such in the Gold Museum in Bogota. And it represents a chief here on a raft made of reeds, together with his entourage, undertaking the ritual ceremony of El Dorado. Now, what was this ceremony? Very briefly, as described by Europeans, this ceremony involved coating, as it were, these person with gold, first with dressing them with gold, and then embarking on a raft made of reeds on the sacred lake of Guatavita, where they would, in the eastern highlands of Colombia, where they would make a gold offering. This is the origins of the legend of El Dorado. You can see how things move from El Dorado, the Golden One, being a man, to El Dorado being a mythical place that Europeans hoped to find that would be full of gold. And this is the origin of many other films and popular culture that we are aware of. But anyway, so that's the story. But back to the real archaeology, if you like. That Muisca raft is just one of many items of votive goldwork that we know the Muisca produced. The Muisca were Chibcha-speaking, relatively egalitarian agricultural society that inhabited the eastern highlands of Colombia at the time the Europeans arrived there. And they are particularly famous because of their mining of emeralds and trade of salt, but also, perhaps most conspicuously, because of their goldwork. The goldwork, the typical objects are these so-called tunjos, which are relatively small, in most cases, anthropomorphic figurines that tend to represent, in this rather stylized design, different characters. And without going in detail, you have, for example, here a hunter with his spear thrower. Here we would have a warrior with his bow and arrows and his trophy head coming back from battle. And here we have clearly a mother with their baby. Now, looking at the technology for these figurines, every one of them would have started their life not as gold, but as beeswax. And this is something that I need to emphasize, even though I'm sure, again, some of you will be familiar with. Every one of these figurines that we've studied was made using the lost wax casting technique. This technology, for those who are not familiar with it, involves starting by designing the figurine, or whatever you are doing, with beeswax, which is, of course, much more malleable and allows you to create any shape. So they are never working with metal plaques or metal wires. They design everything in beeswax, and then these beeswax model, they coat it first with a mixture of charcoal, dust, and clay, and progressively with a clay mold. So they create a mother mold around it. When the whole thing dries, you can then melt the wax out and then refill the void with metal. You then break the mold and obtain a gold object that is an almost identical copy of your original wax mold. You may need to polish, clean, add finishing touches, but that's it in essence. And so the need to emphasize here, what I need to emphasize here is that in the creation of these figures, there is a lot of work in the modeling of the wax, particularly for these complex ones with pendants, etc. These are our experimental reconstructions that require loads of tubes that will first are of wax and then for the metal to run into the object, etc., etc., etc. That's enough for now, just to remember that what we see in gold once existed in wax. Now, these figurines typically appear in groups, in caches, in offering vessels, and they are understood to have been votive offerings made to the deities, typically in special locations, a cave, a particular rock, a lake. They are thought to have been there to help with some supernatural aspiration, if you like. And I'll come back to that in a second. If you look at their chemistry very briefly, we can see in this graph, each dot is one of those figurines. And just in general, what we can see is that their composition varies from those very rich in gold to those very rich in copper, with then relatively low amounts of silver coming just as a natural impurity in the gold. There's nothing too exciting here. It becomes more interesting when we look at these compositions on an offering by offering basis. Because what we're going to see is that each group of objects forms a compositional cluster. This is suggesting to us that all of the objects that appear together were made together with a single batch of metal. Indeed, through our technical study, we've been arguing in our publications that in each case there was a single batch of metal, but also a single artisan with idiosyncratic traits that allow us to assign the various objects to the same artisan. And iconographically, they each represent a theme that can be maternity, war, drug consumption, etc. So all of these form individual meanings, and they were made together for the offering. So they are not gold objects that are made for display. They have a very short life. They are commissioned, made, offered. Now, this idea of each representing a chemical batch is one that we have substantiated through trace element analysis. The kind of thing that we're hoping to do in Africa gives you a better characterization, and we still see that objects that appear together tend to cluster together, suggesting that they form an individual chemical batch. But what I would really like to emphasize and focus on just for a couple of minutes here is the fact that in these figures, what really matters is not so much the gold, but the wax that was used to create them to start with. So let me exemplify that with just a couple of offerings. First one, this one, is a tiny offering made of these very small figurines that are hombres canasto, basket men. They are men holding their knees around their arms in the basket position, which is a very good position for collecting thoughts, for thinking. Now, under the scanning electron microscope, what you can see is a very particular way of modeling the wax. These artists, obviously the same for the two objects, created these horizontal coils for the eyes and then the nose cutting across, etc. But what I would like to highlight here is that after this very intricate, meticulous work with the wax, they turn it into metal, they cast it, and they've never cleaned it properly. They've never polished it. They've never made it pretty in the way we would expect it today. Look at these black patches here and there behind the nose, in cracks and crevices. Those are remains of the molds that were applied to the wax originally. If you remember, you make your modeling wax, then you apply charcoal, dust, and clay to it, then ceramic, then you melt the metal, etc. But when you take your metal out of the mold, of course, it's going to be dirty. Now here, they haven't cleaned it out. This is great for us archaeologists because we can take tiny samples of that, as we are doing, and radiocarbon date all of these objects. But it's quite peculiar. They invest all of this time in creating the object, then they don't clean it properly. And look also at these kind of casting flashes and fractures. Nobody really bothers polishing or finishing them properly. Clearly, that's not the expectation. Otherwise, they would have done it. And I'll just show you another few examples from another offering, the one of Suba, found in Suba, which is one of my favorites. This is possibly among my top 3 favorite tunjos because it's truly extraordinary. This is one that represents a mother with a baby, which is a common motif. And here, the work with the wax is extraordinary. So you can see the baby here looking at us and the fingers of the mother wrapping around them. But look at, just as an example, the lips of the baby were modeled using a coil of wax that is 1/3 of a millimeter in diameter. So there's a lot of dexterity in creating this figure that is about this size. And then you cast it in metal, and when you cast it, you get the odd casting flash through a crack in your mold, and nobody has bothered to clean that out, to polish it off, to cut it, which would be really easy. So clearly that doesn't matter to them. Look at these baby tied up to a cot. Again, there was a void in the mold, the casting wasn't perfect, nobody bothers. There's plenty of examples of objects that we can presume were well made in the wax, but not so well made in the gold. There must be a reason for that. Look at this object. Again, we presume it was properly made in wax. Something went wrong with it during the casting to the point that we can no longer recognize who this character is. Now, in any other place, in the modern world at least, we would expect this figure to go back to the melting pot for recycling, and you give it another go. Here, this figure is deemed to be good as the others, and it's placed in the offering alongside the others. So clearly, and I hope you're getting me, there's a different set of cultural parameters that are dictating how an object is made and what an object should look like and what is valuable about that object. And in pondering this, we found, I won't say a final answer, but certainly something that's suggestive by looking at the ethnography of the region. If you go to the eastern highlands of Colombia today, you may be lucky to find the Uva. The Uva are a Chibcha-speaking community that still inhabits the eastern highlands of Colombia. So they are, of course, with all due reservations, the closest we have to present-day descendants of the Muisca. And interestingly, among the Uva, there are many foundational myths that refer to bees and wax and honey, which are supposed to have a lot of ritual importance. Bees are a model of the organized society, and wax and honey are consumed often in rituals together with drugs to get inspiration, but also to increase your fertility and sexual prowess. There's loads of texts that emphasize the importance of bees and wax, and so it is risky, but we are tempted to somewhat project that into the past and think that in the making of all of these tunjos, perhaps what really mattered was the ritual manipulation of wax more than the gold itself, which they never bothered polishing. So with all of these that we've learned in this very quick tour, we can revisit the famous Muisca raft that has been long held as a great work of art, which it certainly is, of course. But interestingly, you put it under the microscope and you find the things that we've been finding elsewhere. Some accidents, such as that falling feather that nobody has bothered to repair. It is grotty, it is dirty. You have all of those black patches that are remains of the mold. We have radiocarbon dated it thanks to that, so it's not being cleaned out properly. And these wires that you have on the sides of these individual characters, so this is the raft, that's one of the characters. His hands are here. These wires are the feeders that fed the metal to create this figure. In any other workshop, you would then cut those off to create a finished product. Here, that's not deemed necessary. And look at, even if we turn it over, we look at the bottom of that famous raft, you can actually see that there's something wrong with it. I think anyone can agree that the original intention and the wax model was something like this, a raft made of crisscrossing reeds. When the metal was cast, for some reason, the mold shattered, the metal splashed out, but nobody has seen this as an accident. Nobody has tried to repair it or try again. This is the way in which the object was offered in a cave of Colombia. So I find it particularly interesting and captivating, really, and I'll finish with the Muisca now, that when the Muisca raft was discovered in 1968, the Bank of Colombia decided to print it on their money. And I like this very much because in a single picture, we have a representation of two totally different ways of understanding gold, two totally different value systems. Of course, we are familiar with the European understanding of gold as a way of stocking wealth and as a material that we use for showing off, for display. But among the Muisca, as I've hopefully persuaded you very briefly, among the Muisca, the gold had no value as currency, other than as ritual currency, if you like. It was a metal not meant to be seen with the eyes of this world, but with the eyes of another world. That's why they were placed in offerings. And it is a material that may have been less valuable, at least ritually, than other humble materials, such as beeswax. But talking about showing off, you're going to allow me to jump again in space and time to introduce the last person of this talk, one that many of you will know, Qin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor of China. Qin Shi Huangdi, he was only 13, some 2,200 years ago, when his father died and he became the king of Qin. Qin was just one of many states in the Warring States period that were battling each other in this period in China. But he immediately embarked on a series of mighty military campaigns that led him to become the first emperor of unified China. Of course, the name China today derives most likely from the Qin dynasty. And he became really famous for many things. He created the beginnings of the Great Wall. He standardized religion, law, philosophy, weights, measures, script. But also, and very famously, he commissioned the creation of a mausoleum to host him in the afterlife. This is just an aerial view of the first emperor's mausoleum in China, with the mound or pyramid where we believe he's still buried. Loads of constructions around it that continue to be excavated. I won't have the time to go into that, but I'll just say that this was built between 10 and 30 years, so a relatively short period. The surface span of it is about 100 square kilometers. And I've checked it, and that's roughly the size of Nicosia, to give you a sense of scale, or Nicosia, sorry. So the size of this city is the size of this emperor's funerary city for himself. So he was indeed a show-off. But of course, what everyone knows is that in order to host and protect his afterlife, he commissioned here to the east, facing the enemies, the creation of the Terracotta Army. Thousands of life-sized warriors stationed there in military formation, waiting for the enemy and to protect the emperor in the afterlife. For a good number of years, I've been extremely privileged to be involved in a project involving many of us that's been trying to reverse engineer the Terracotta Army and the broader mausoleum. We're trying to understand how materials, ideas, and people were brought together and converged harmoniously to create something so unique and yet so large. And so in doing that, we've involved a lot of scientific approaches, trying to understand where the raw materials coming from, identifying the various pigments employed. So using many technologies that actually are indeed used at Star C, and some of which we've already been publishing for years. But I thought that for today, because of time constraints, I would just focus on a particular dimension of our work that also connects, though in a rather modest way, with some of the expertise available at Star C. Now, as I've mentioned, one of the things that we were hoping to do was to understand, in particular with the warriors, how they were constructed. Were they all made in a single factory production line, highly standardized? Are there several production units working in parallel? Was it possible that there were molds for the creation of a set number of heads and legs and arms, etc., which were then combined in different ways, as if you were playing with the Mr. Potato Head, if you're familiar with that, just to create a sense of diversity. So were there molds? How many molds? How were these organized? And so we thought we had done that with weapons. We were hoping to do this with the warriors themselves. And we thought we'd just measure them, take several anchors for biomarkers, and take those measurements, then run multivariate statistics, and identify groups of warriors or warrior parts that would have derived from the same mold. That was quite naive, as we immediately realized, because of course these warriors are very tightly packed together. We were never going to be allowed to go down there in the pit with our calipers and our measuring tapes to measure their nose and ears and foreheads. And so that's what led us to engage with three-dimensional digital models, where we are making here a modest attempt at something that here at Star C they really are superb in their technological excellence. So I hope I won't embarrass some of the people present here with our results, which are not so much about visualization as they are about analysis, as I'm about to explain. Now, of course, these things are compatible. What we did there, because we couldn't touch the warriors, or at least not repeatedly, was to use structure from motion. That is, we are creating more and more three-dimensional digital models from ordinary digital pictures. So we're not using typical 3D scanning, but instead we're taking, say, of this single warrior, those are the camera positions. So we take 100 digital photographs with an ordinary camera, and then we use computing to bring those pictures together to create a point cloud to which you can then add color, texture, etc. And so you have a perfect 3D model of an object without touching it and without needing to measure much or anything. So this is great for public display. We've 3D printed a few warriors. They're in smaller size. And also, you can now get up and close and personal with them. These models can be appreciated on free software on a tablet or on your phone. But what's of particular interest for us is that these models are made of points. And now, without touching the warriors, we can measure the distance between any of these 250,000 points here, or indeed compare the shape altogether or various parts, etc. Now, it's early days because our sample is still very small, but I thought I would present to us our initial case study that actually focused on the ears of the warriors. We focused to start with on the ears simply because they are relatively small and manageable, but at the same time complex, just to develop our data acquisition and analysis protocols, but also because, interestingly, ears, as you may know, they are as individual as our fingerprints. No two ears are the same, and so it would be an interesting take into the standardization or individualization of these warriors. Of course, always hoping to then analyze other warrior parts. But there was another reason that we thought this was interesting, and the other reason is given to us by Giovanni Morelli, a famous 19th century art historian and connoisseur who established what he called the scientific approach to art history. And his scientific approach involved, as connoisseurs go, trying to attribute unsigned works of art to individual artists. And the way he did it was by looking at the ears and the hands, because those, according to him, were relatively accessory components of a portrait that were the giveaway for a particular artist. So Fra Filippo would tend to create ears that were always more concave or smaller than those created by Bonifacio and so on. So we thought it would be fun to try and do a proper or modern science approach to art history using ears as well. Now, the big headline, I suppose, of the work we've done so far is the method works, which is what we were hoping to establish. And we can indeed compare shapes using these methods, because we don't have such a big sample to present anything conclusive yet. So I'm only presenting to you our initial results, which are very exciting, but on a very small sample. Why are they exciting? Because, well, on this plot here, we have, on a multi-dimensional space, if you like, representations of 40 or 50 ears. Now, 50 ears in a population of about 15,000 is not a representative sample. But the way they are presented here, each dot represents an ear. The closer two dots are together, the more similar in shape those ears are. And what we see here is basically that no two ears are the same. There are no two perfectly overlapping points. What we have is a cloud of very similar ears, and then in the extremes, a few outliers of ears that are particularly concave or that have a particularly big lobe or have something special about them. Now, why is this exciting? Because if we were to do that with us here today, we would obtain a very similar distribution. It is the distribution that you would expect in the real population, where most of our ears look pretty much the same, but they are not identical, and then a few of us have particularly odd ears. So this has kind of reignited the debate as to the extent to which the warriors are individual, which is one to which we are hoping to contribute, but only really substantially once we've analyzed other body parts and larger numbers of samples. But I just thought it would be interesting to show you how we are engaging some of the technologies that you're so good at here, but for slightly different purposes. And I think there's loads of points where we could converge. And this is, of course, just one of the many things that we are doing with the Terracotta Army. And the Terracotta Army is just one of the many projects that I have been extremely privileged to be involved with, and which I've been trying to highlight here just to not persuade you, because I'm sure you are already on the same page as me, but to highlight really the pertinence and the need, indeed, and the fun of combining archaeology and the sciences. Now, if you allow me a rather tacky gastronomic parallel, we could say that archaeology is halloumi and science is carpuzzi. Each of them on their own are absolutely amazing. Now put them together, and what you get is something that's much more than the sum of the individual parts. It is something bold, it's something that is unexpectedly good, perhaps, is something that invites sharing, and that has great potential, much greater potential than either of those two separately. Slightly more seriously, I hope that through this talk, I have shown how, through archaeological sciences, we get to meet a lot of people. People who are, in many cases, are no longer here, some of which are very famous, some of which are anonymous. And in that sense, we often complain that we really have no science or technique that allows us to make our life longer. And I would argue that if one science can do it, can make our life longer, that is archaeological science, but stretching our life backwards by meeting those people and living those lives that were here before us. But perhaps more importantly, archaeological sciences also make our life broader, wider, richer, because through the medium of the archaeological sciences, we meet other people, we meet other value systems, we meet other ways of doing things, other ways of relating with each other and with the environment. We have seen in this brief presentation how risky it is to trust our common sense, as in the case of the local amber for the Iberian Peninsula. We have also seen that you don't really need kings or emperors in order to achieve technological and artistic sophistication, such as crossing the Sahara or indeed creating goldwork in Colombia. We have seen that our values are not universal, and we should be reminded of that. More generally, I believe that when we do archaeological sciences, generally, we are often reminded that boundaries and borders are temporary conventions. And this applies to disciplines as it does to political borders and indeed to mental barriers. And as we get to find and meet other people who are different from us, we become a little bit more aware of our position in the world. And in so doing, we become a little bit more humble and more respectful of differences and so on. And it is for this reason that I think archaeological sciences should be supported, for these and many other reasons. And it is for that reason that I would certainly like to add my congratulations, not just to Professor Papanikolaos, but to the Cyprus Institute, or indeed to Cyprus more generally, or those of us outside Cyprus for this great initiative. And also for that reason, I would like to invite you to join me in thanking once again the A.G. Leventis Foundation for making it possible. Thank you very much. Should I sit down? I don't know what happens now.
Maybe we will leave it. Thank you, Professor Martino Torres, for this fascinating lecture. I'm now inviting questions from the audience. Do we have any questions? There's one at the back.
Maybe a stupid question, but I've been wondering this briefly.
We cannot
Can I
hear
hear
you.
you?
Okay, maybe now? You ready?
Better.
Okay. I've been wondering this ever since you showed the picture of El Dorado, in the way with the unfinished underside. And is it possible that it's simply that one was actually a failure, and that's maybe why it was found? It was put somewhere along with other failures. And,
No, it's an absolutely pertinent question, and is one of those cases where you might be inclined to think that, but you would rule that out if you work with local archaeologists and you contextualize these finds. Why? Because in archaeological excavations, they appear in contexts that are clearly of ritual importance because of where they are located, how they are placed, and also looking at the history of goldsmithing in Colombia, you can see that they were perfectly capable of producing well-finished objects. And actually those errors, they're relatively easy to mend if you're a modern jeweler. It's just that clearly they don't mind, or indeed they intend them to look half-finished, things that are probably too long to discuss today and that I have written about. But no, it's clearly not, because even if you have a failure with gold, you don't just throw it away. You remelt it and try again.
Thank you. More questions? Yes. Let me have a microphone across to you.
Thank you. I was very interested to hear at the beginning of your presentation that you referred, where does the future of archaeology lie? And it was suggested in archaeological excavation and also in the lab, which I agree completely. And it also reminds me of something that I read in the papers some 15, 20 years ago, and I started to be corrected if I've got it wrong by the Department of Antiquities. But after some excavations were conducted in one of the royal tombs in Cyprus, around that time, further excavations, they found a piece, a bead from a bracelet or necklace that matched the Cesnola collection in the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And so in MoMA, they say the museum, yeah, in the Metropolitan Museum of New York. And I thought that was fascinating because it really interprets your suggestion, where does it lie, in excavation and in the lab. So we could then tell that that particular necklace or bracelet came from that particular location of a royal tomb.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I'm all fond of
Thank you.
Scientific work in archaeology, but that has to go hand in hand with archaeological excavations. Of course, sometimes we make amazing discoveries in museums with materials that were excavated decades ago, some of which I presented today, but equally we need to continue excavating and disseminating, and how that's the way in which I think all of our disciplines converge. And even that separation between the field and the laboratory that I make out here just for simplification purposes is not really real anymore, because you have mobile laboratories such as those you have at Star C here, which allow you to take the laboratory to the field. But yeah, they have to go hand in hand.
More questions? Okay, we don't have any more questions. Then we can definitely continue the discussion outside. Thank you all very much for joining us today. Thank you to our special speaker, and please join us for wine and cheese. Thank you.
Thank you.